Well, hey out there, and welcome back to another installment of our Sacred Conversation series. I do hope that all of you are well out there. I hope that you're hanging in during what feels like a pretty fraught season and a pretty fraught week. I don't know when you'll be watching this, but as we're recording this, this is the Wednesday before Election Day. So, we're hoping to get through to next Wednesday. But listen, thank you for tuning in for this conversation. Today, we're going to try something just a little bit different. Our guest today is Carolyn Wakeman, and Carolyn is known to many in our community, but if you don't happen to know her, she is a member of the church, and she functions not only as our church historian, but also as a historian for the towns of Lyme and Old Lyme. For years now, she has been combing the archives that exist at the Florence Griswold Museum, that exist within our church, and that exist within the town halls of Lyme and Old Lyme, discovering stories and unearthing details that nobody else has really had the diligence and the curiosity to seek out. And yet it is all right there, waiting just to be found. And one result of that research is her recent book. I have it right here. I hope you can see it. This beautiful book, Forgotten Voices, The Hidden History of a New England Meetinghouse, which is a history of our community, of our church, FCCOL. It was published late last year by Wesleyan University Press. It is a powerful piece of work, and we can be grateful to Carolyn for the unbelievable job she has done assembling the stories from these archives. She has combed through sermons, she's combed through church records, she's combed through diaries and letters in order to write the fullest account of the history of our community that we have ever had. Some of the stories are difficult, some are less than flattering, but they're all true and thus worthy of our attention and worthy of our careful consideration. More than that, I just want to say that this book itself is a beautiful product. It's a work of art, filled with old photographs, filled with paintings, filled with displays of records and so forth. So the final product here is just a gorgeous piece of work, and I hope that all of you out there listening to this will be able to go out and purchase this. It is available for purchase in the church office. If you'd like a copy, I think it's at the Florence Griswold Museum gift shop as well, and probably in some other places. But Carolyn's got a lecture that she's going to deliver today. And so rather than a conversation, as we usually do in this format, Carolyn's going to deliver a PowerPoint presentation on the history of our community. And so we're really, really fortunate to have her with us on this, and really, really fortunate to hear some of her insights and to see some of these images and to learn some of these stories that we hadn't previously known. By way of background, I'll just say that Carolyn grew up in Old Lyme, but she went on to become a professor of journalism at the University of California, Berkeley. And she directed the Asia Pacific program there, but she has now returned and she lives right here in Old Lyme. And we are immensely privileged to have her in our community. So Carolyn, thank you so much for being a part of this today and for sharing your the product of your research with us. And I'll simply turn it over to you from here.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And thank you everyone for joining this afternoon for this virtual sacred conversation. You know, Steve has really been part of this project from the very beginning. That was some 5 years ago when I said, you know, Steve, I think it's time we took a new look, a fresh look at the history of the Meetinghouse. And ever since then, he's engaged with the project. He's encouraged me really every step of the way, and I'm exceedingly grateful. And also I want to thank Carleen and Laura for their ongoing help and their support as well. This research began in the small closet office upstairs in the parish house, where alongside Betsy Webster, the church's dedicated and extraordinarily insightful historian, I started organizing a trove of archival documents that had not been examined for many years. The book Forgotten Voices, which Steve just showed you, reflects my effort to reconsider and also reconnect the small details of meeting house history that show how the church and the larger community evolved over 250 years. As an epigraph for Forgotten Voices, I chose a line from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. For last year's words belong to last year's language, and next year's words await another voice. I call that to your attention today because history is never a finished task. What I learned growing up in Old Limes Church is not at all what I understand today. History changes as we discover new sources, look at the world with different eyes, and ask new questions. And history, especially now, especially it seems this week, really matters. It urgently matters. As Harvard's president emerita Drew Gilpin Faust recently reminded us, the stories we tell about ourselves shape how we see not just the past, but also the present. Here's the famous painting of the Old Lyme Church by Childe Hassam, the most prominent of the Impressionist artists who spent summers in Old Lyme after the turn of the 20th century. Steve and others have remarked in the past several weeks that while we miss the interior of the meeting house during these months of pandemic, the services held outside on the church lawn allow us to gaze upon and absorb the grace and beauty of the facade and the soaring white spire. But today I will ask you to step back inside the meeting house and look at those familiar surroundings with fresh eyes. Here you see Lyme a century ago, and I want to start my journey through meeting house history with this familiar landscape. Here you see the fourth meeting house before the catastrophic fire that destroyed this beautiful building in 1907. And you see the church corner, as it was called when I was growing up, as it looked when Hassam painted it in 1903 and 1905. To begin this journey back in time, we can look first at the landscape of Meeting House Hill in this painting by Henry Ward Ranger that hangs in the Old Lyme Library. Here, the first meeting house was built in about 1670 on a hilltop looking across the Connecticut River to Saybrook Point. The brave colonists built their meeting house here because of the danger of attack from menacing Indians, I learned as a fourth grader when I walked with my classmates here from Center School on an all-day picnic outing to Lyme's most historic location. I did not learn anything about the removal of Native Americans from their tribal land or why the Indians, as they were called, might have opposed the English colonists' settlement on the east side of the river. And I had never heard of the Pequot War. Half a century later, I discovered that Reverend Arthur Shirley, an earlier minister of our church, in a sermon in 1893, exploring the church's progress over its first 200 years, stressed that Lyme's early settlers did not, in fact, find themselves, quote, in the midst of fierce and treacherous and bloodthirsty tribes, unquote, when they built their first meeting house. Quite the contrary, he said. After the regrettable colonial assault that nearly exterminated local Pequots along the Mystic River in 1637 during the Pequot War, the first settlers' interactions with the Indians was wholly of a peaceful nature. The hilltop site of Lyme's first three meeting houses had long been a destination for residents when I picnicked there as a fourth grader and puzzled with my friends over the inscriptions on the old gravestones nearby and peered through the brush at the mile marker left by Benjamin Franklin's survey team. Here you see a photograph of the Luddington family on their favorite Sunday outing to the Meeting House Hill after church. There they enjoyed the view across the river, and later they placed pennies in the cracks of a nearby boulder they called Penny Rock for their delighted young grandchildren to discover. Now I want to move back in time, way back in fact, with this exact map of New England that Cotton Mather included as a fold-out insert in his lengthy history of New England churches called Magnolia Christi, published in 1706. The map shows how churches were proliferating in the New England wilderness and how the Christian message was being spread. And although you can't see clearly from this slide, The map shows church icons in only 4 towns in the Connecticut colony east of the Connecticut River: in Lyme, New London, Norwich, and Stonington. By 1706, when this map was printed, Lyme's first minister, Moses Noyes, who arrived from his home in Newbury, Massachusetts, as a recent Harvard graduate at age 22, had been preaching here already for 40 years. Here is Reverend Noyes' gravestone in the Duck River Cemetery. You can see it today in a glass case in the church fellowship hall and read the inscription, which commends him as a modest, learned, orthodox, and pious divine who died in his 86th year. Today, we know a few more things about Moses Noyes. We know, for example, that he lived with his family in a homestead on the east side of what is now Upper Lime Street. This is a pencil sketch. This is a pencil sketch I found in the Florence Griswold Museum archives, mixed in with various Noyes family papers. Ellen Noyes Chadwick, a descendant of the minister and a local artist, made this drawing at her father's instruction. The first minister's house had been torn down in about 1814, but Enoch Noyes still remembered it from his childhood, and Ellen drew this likeness according to his recollection. This crudely lettered gravestone tells us that the minister's wife, Ruth Pickett Noyes, died in 1690 at age 36. She left 4 young children for him to raise, and in 1719, when Reverend Noyes drafted his own will, he left his enslaved servant Arabella to his youngest child, Sarah. No documents have been found to let us know when or how Arabella arrived in Lyme, but it seems likely that she helped care for the widowed minister's children, as well as performing domestic labor in his household. We do know that Ruth's father, a prosperous New London merchant, died on a voyage from Barbados, that he owned an enslaved African, and that 2 of Ruth's brothers continued to trade with Barbados. Whether Reverend Noyes acquired Arabella through his wife's family, through his own family in the Boston area, where an older brother was a slaveholder, or through local purchase is not known. But he named his slave after the ship Arbella that carried the Boston Bay Colony's governor, John Winthrop, to New England in 1630. What else did I learn about the first minister? I had never thought about the family he left behind in Newbury in 1666. I did know that his older brother James was already preaching in Stonington, but I had no idea that 2 other brothers would soon own land in Lyme, or that his cousin Nicholas Noyes, also a Harvard graduate from Newbury, had settled as minister in East Haddam, just over the Lyme border, in 1668, 2 years after Moses Noyes' own arrival. Nicholas Noyes had preached there for 13 years until returning to what they called the Bay to become minister in Salem. Both Reverend Nicholas Noyes and Moses Noyes' brother-in-law, Reverend John Hale, minister in nearby Beverly, were deeply involved with the Salem witch trials. I knew John Hale only as a character in Arthur Miller's play The Crucible, and I was startled to learn that he had married the Lyme minister's sister, Sarah Noyes, and that she had also been accused of witchcraft. Here you see the treatise that John Hale wrote to acknowledge the mistakes of Salem's witchcraft persecutions. We can never know what Moses Noyes thought about the witchcraft hysteria or his sister's accusations, but we do know that he was closely connected to those responsible for a series of witchcraft executions. Only one of Moses Noyes' sermons survives. We found in the church files a typescript of a sermon he delivered at the Collegiate School in Saybrook in 1707. Here you see the certificate allowing the establishment of a collegiate school in the Connecticut colony in 1701. And some of you know that the school later moved to New Haven, where it was named Yale College in 1718. The surprising topic of Reverend Noyes' sermon was childbearing, based on a literal reading of the passage in Genesis that says Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. In some detail, at age 63, when he was a grandfather, Reverend Noyes advised the young students that both men and women may have children when they are exceeding old. At the end of his life, Moses Noyes married Temperance and Oxford, two persons enslaved by Richard Lord on his large farm in the section of Lyme we know today as Tannamahaig. You can see the recording of that marriage at the very bottom of your screen, just in a couple of lines at the very end. Not only were slave marriages then rare, but until recently, marriage had been a civil union conducted by magistrates rather than ministers. And this is the only marriage I have found conducted by Reverend Noyes. Why Richard Lord wanted the union of his slaves to be authorized by the minister, we can only guess. But it is important to note that since slaves were considered property, the marriage was recorded in the land records. I noticed this page in an account book kept by Reverend Noyes' neighbor, Joseph Peck Jr., just by chance when I was poring through materials archived at the State Library in Hartford. Peck was a farmer and merchant, and in 1715 he sold large quantities of sugar by the pound and rum by the pint and quart, along with wheat, oats, and beef. He delivered wood by the sled load and provided hay storage in his barn, and he also, on at least two occasions in 1718, hired out a slave. The account book shows that he charged 1 shilling for a, quote, black boy 1 day, unquote, and 3 shillings for a black boy 1 day with harrow. Joseph Peck, on at least 2 occasions, sold slaves. Here you see a deed of sale entered in the land records in 1729. In consideration of the sum of 25 pounds, he sold to Benjamin Reed of Lyme one certain mulatto girl of about 3 years old called Jane. Jane may in fact be the daughter of Temperance, whom Peck had previously sold to Richard Lord shortly before her marriage, but there is no birth record. Peck's father, Joseph Peck Sr., served as one of Lyme's 2 earliest deacons. Jonathan Parsons succeeded as minister after Reverend Noyes' death in 1727, soon after graduating from Yale. He left Lyme some 18 years later at age 40, amid what were repeatedly called scandalous events during the religious revival movement known as the Great Awakening. Here you see a photograph of a pastel portrait painted of Jonathan Parsons after he left Lyme in 1745 for Newbury, Moses Noyes' home. Parsons lived next door to today's Meetinghouse, although the present church site was then an empty field. This photograph shows his house much altered over more than a century. After Jonathan Parsons left Lyme, his son Marshfield turned the parsonage into a tavern, and during the Revolutionary War, Parsons Tavern was a stagecoach stop for passengers who crossed the Connecticut River on the ferry that connected Lyme with Saybrook and Boston with New York. Reverend Parsons owned at least 2 slaves, a child Cato, who died at age 10 in 1734, and a maidservant Phyllis, whom he baptized in 1740. Half a century later, according to the first federal census, his son Marshfield Parsons, the innkeeper and tavern owner, held 4 slaves. In this image of a sermon dated February 22nd, 1736, titled God Governs by His Providence, you can see the minister's cramped handwriting on very small pages stitched together with string. The sermon is not signed, but is assumed to have been delivered by Jonathan Parsons in the Hilltop Meetinghouse during his early ministry. We associate Reverend Parsons with the doctrinal disputes and scandals of the Great Awakening, but in 1734, a retired minister named David Deming became embroiled in the parish in a personal scandal. Deming had served as a substitute for Reverend Parsons in the pulpit and was accused of sexually abusing a young girl. He was also Lyme's schoolteacher, and court records provide vivid details of the incident in the schoolhouse. Deming wrote a letter of confession to the church, pledging that he would thenceforth lead, quote, a good and unspotted life. And after 2 years, the subject of his abuse, who was then 12 years old, reversed her testimony. That allowed the court to find the minister not guilty, and the church restored his privileges. In 1740, Parsons traveled to New Haven to hear a sermon by the itinerant British evangelist, Reverend George Whitefield, who was transfixing audiences during his first New England tour with his emotional appeal and charismatic style. Inspired by Whitefield, Parsons transformed his own ministry to accomplish what he called the very gracious revival of religion among us. But the Great Awakening split his congregation. After 5 long years of bitter dispute and harsh accusations of slander, for example, when Deacon Reynold Marvin claimed that prominent church member Edmund Dorr was no more a Christian than any Indian in Niantic, Jonathan Parsons left Lyme, and at Reverend Whitefield's recommendation, became minister of a small separatist church in Newbury. Here you see a rock on the south side of the driveway of today's Meetinghouse, where George Whitefield supposedly preached to crowds in Lyme in 1745. Charles Luddington, who then owned Parsons' much remodeled home, stands on what I always knew as Whitefield Rock. In fact, Betsy Webster and I, some years ago, painstakingly cleared away the brush that almost obscures the rock today. But that was before I researched this important occasion and realized that it most likely never happened. If you read the details and connect the dots, you find that Whitefield did indeed preach in Lyme in August 1745, 2 months before Parsons left for Newbury, but he preached only in Lyme's East Parish, which we now call East Lyme. By then, the evangelist's reputation had been badly tarnished and his emotional excesses widely discredited, including in Parsons' West Parish. And the only record of his visit that I could find, a diary written by Joshua Hempstead, who attended several of Whitefield's outdoor sermons, states that he preached in the East Parish, spent the night at a house near Niantic's Rope Ferry, and from there proceeded on to Long Island and New York to continue his tour. Scandals in Lyme's church continued during the ministry of Stephen Johnson, who is familiar to some of you who regularly see his corner chair in today's Meetinghouse behind the pulpit. More importantly, you may know that Stephen Johnson published 6 letters in a new London newspaper in the years leading up to the Revolutionary War, protesting the Stamp Act and urging resistance to British rule. That defiant spirit brought Johnson wide recognition. This map, drawn more than a decade after Stephen Johnson became minister by his friend Reverend Ezra Stiles, later president of Yale, gives you a sense of what Lyme looked like in the years before the Revolution. You see the Meetinghouse on the hill, approximately across from the Meetinghouse in Saybrook. You also see a road leading from the Meetinghouse past the site of Parsons Tavern to the ferry crossing, which was then upriver from today's Ferry Point, where the distance across the river was only half a mile. I found this third example of an early sermon in a file of assorted sermons in the Flogriz archives. It is also written on small pages and stitched with string, but unlike the sermon by Jonathan Parsons, it uses vivid language to address current events. Written in 1775 after the Battle of Bunker Hill, the sermon laments that, quote, "the flames of war have already begun to rage with merciless fury in a neighboring province." The sermon warns that the British seem, quote, "determined to conquer us by the point of the sword unless we will give up our lives, religion, liberty, and property to their absolute disposal." The sermon is unsigned, but its wording echoes the language Johnson used in his letters a decade earlier, calling for resistance to British rule. Soon after this sermon was written, Stephen Johnson would serve as a chaplain with Continental troops near Boston. In the last period of his 40-year ministry in Lyme, Reverend Johnson devoted himself to theological concerns. The church archives have a leather-bound copy of this 350-page treatise on salvation, a topic that he preached about repeatedly before his death in 1786. But the minister's own life had not been free from scandal. He married 3 times, each time to a wealthy and well-connected woman, and after the death of his first wife in 1761, he spent a year defending himself against charges of adultery. Rumors had already become public that he had engaged in adultery with Hannah Lay, and during extended court proceedings, several members of the congregation, along with 2 slaves, were called to testify. A slave of Mrs. Lay's husband stated that he had seen his mistress with the minister naked on a bed, but that testimony was discounted, and Stephen Johnson was awarded damages. During the extended proceedings, an ecclesiastical council was called to consider whether the minister should be dismissed, and church records omit the results of that meeting. But Reverend Johnson remained as minister for many years. As political concerns gathered momentum, problems with the minister's personal life faded from view. Unlike Lyme's 2 previous ministers, Reverend Johnson, as far as I can tell, did not own slaves, but he also did not embrace the anti-slavery views heralded by other New London County ministers, like Reverend Levi Hart in Lebanon. Johnson's son and namesake owned a slave. His friend Matthew Griswold, who became Connecticut's governor, owned multiple slaves. And according to church records, Reverend Johnson baptized multiple enslaved adults and children, presumably in the Meetinghouse on the hill. While Reverend Hart in Lebanon cried out against slavery, saying in 1774, "Is it not high time for this colony to wake up and put an official stop to the cruel business of stealing and selling our fellow men?" Stephen Johnson championed political liberty, but about slave owning, he remained silent. We cannot know what the exterior of the Meetinghouse looked like during Reverend Johnson's ministry, but we do have a pencil sketch that lets us glimpse the interior. Church treasurer William Colt drew from memory this floor plan in 1876 when Lyme celebrated the country's centennial. You can't see the details clearly, but the drawing shows 5 aisles separating 4 sets of pews, a pulpit with a sounding board overhead on the north side, and the main entrance on the west side, below the steeple and belfry. It also shows 2 stairways leading up to the gallery or balcony. On the eve of his ordination as Reverend Johnson's successor, the new minister, Lathrop Rockwell, from Lebanon, Connecticut, was examined on theological doctrines here, in the parlor of the largest house in town, today's parsonage, but then the home of Samuel Mather Jr., a wealthy merchant who held 4 slaves. Lathrop Rockwell is barely remembered today, but his ministry spanned the years of the early republic and ushered Lyme into a new century. In a funeral sermon for former Governor Matthew Griswold in 1799, he offered a last tribute of respect to one who has been useful in life, a private and public blessing in his day and his generation. Reverend Rockwell's parsonage was the next house to the north from the Samuel Mather house, today's parsonage. Reverend Rockwell's parsonage was the next house to the north of today's parsonage. The large estate we know as Boxwood would not be built for another 50 years. You can recognize Rockwell's parsonage today just south of the Cooley Gallery on Lyme's Main Street. Here is the funeral sermon for Matthew Griswold that I just mentioned, delivered in 1799. A new generation would bring far-reaching changes. The role of women in the church expanded in 1816 when Phoebe Lord, shown here in a miniature portrait by her daughter Phoebe Griffin Lord, after whom Old Lyme's library is named, launched a female reading society in her parlor in 1816. The minutes of the Society's meetings are preserved in this faded notebook in the Flogris archives, along with the prayer that Reverend Rockwell delivered, empowering his sisters in Christ to attend not just to their private devotions, but to participate also in missionary endeavors. But while the role of women in the church enlarged in the early 19th century, the place of African Americans did not change. As slavery declined significantly in Connecticut and in Lyme after the Revolution, the number of recently free Blacks formerly held as slaves increased. But in Lyme, emancipated Blacks were still relegated to box pews in the rear corners of the Meetinghouse gallery, hot in summer, cold in winter, and essentially out of sight. In 1814, the Ecclesiastical Society actually specified that pew reservations in the meeting house would be made for white persons only. But it did make one concession and voted also to raise the seats of the Black people in the gallery in such a manner to enable them to see the minister. As our former President Obama would say, think about that. Just think about that for a minute. Sermons like this one, preached in New Haven by Jonathan Edwards in 1791, decried the enslavement of Africans, but some of Lyme's most prominent church members, like Marshfield Parsons, continued to hold slaves. Among those slaveholders and church members were William Noyes, a New London County judge, and his daughter-in-law, Mary Ann Noyes, who would serve as the founding president of the Female Reading Society. Here you see them in pastel portraits by James Martin. In the federal census taken in 1800, Samuel Mather Jr. held 2 slaves, Marshfield Parsons held 3, and the Noyes family held 6. Less than a year after the vote to raise the seats for Blacks in the balcony, a lightning strike burned Lyme's 3rd meeting house to the ground. Its replacement was built not on the hilltop, but in the field just north of Parsons Tavern, where the stagecoach highway through town met the road to the ferry. The Ecclesiastical Society purchased that plot from Marshfield Parsons' heirs for $300. This photograph shows the 4th meeting house much later, but lets you see the elegance of the structure completed in 1817 and the graceful facade that we still admire today. Our interchangeable use of the words meeting house and church is recent. Until 1815 in Lyme, the meeting house was a multi-purpose structure, a gathering place for town meetings and justice court hearings, as well as the place for Sabbath worship, prayer meetings, and the catechism or religious education of local youth. The word church referred only to the institution made up of religious believers, not to the building, although it's hard to keep that distinction clear in our minds today. I was surprised to discover, for example, that not until 1808 did the Ecclesiastical Society purchase a Bible to be kept in the meeting house. Here you see the communion service purchased for the new meeting house, by which time the transition from a community building to a house of worship had been accomplished. Not only the location, but the design and the purpose of the meeting house had changed. And the Middlesex Gazette newspaper described the new building as the house of God and the gate of heaven. The architectural details the building committee had already announced would equal in design, quality, and elegance any meeting house in the state of Connecticut east of the Connecticut River. After its completion, the Ecclesiastical Society decided that no town meeting be in any wise held in the meeting house. This engraving by John Mortar Barber, called Westview of Lyme, made in 1834, is the earliest image of the town that we have. Barber places the new meeting house at the center of the landscape, and you can see what we know as the Meeting House Hills in the distance, without the tree cover we know today. To orient you, an arrow points to Samuel Mather's house, today's parsonage. Mather and other successful merchants like John McCurdy had prospered in Lyme before and after the Revolution. This postcard from the early 20th century shows the aging warehouses that still line the Lieutenant River. A warehouse for Barbados goods had been authorized during Moses Noyes' ministry in 1686, and the West Indies trade had benefited not only local merchants, but farmers, mill owners, fishermen, and shipbuilders. Horses, cattle, and surplus farm products had been traded for sugar and rum since 1666, the year Lyme's first minister arrived from Newbury. And local residents continued to play a part in the Atlantic economy, serving as a link in what today we refer to as the triangle trade for almost a century and a half. During Lathrop Rockwell's ministry, our mercantile horizons expanded, and two shipping firms owned by the Griswold family brought wealth to Lyme. Here you see George Griswold, a grandson of the East Lyme minister who invited George Whitefield to preach in 1745 in a bust he commissioned of himself posing rather grandly in a Roman toga. Here you see on the right a wooden box used to transport tea from China on a Griswold clipper ship, and on the left a set of monogrammed Chinese export ware that George Griswold commissioned from the Imperial Chinese kilns at Jingdezhen. The elegant place settings ended up in Lyme, first at Boxwood, the estate on the main street the Griswold son Richard Sill Griswold built in 1840, and now in the collection of the Florence Griswold Museum. Disputes over abolition raged in Connecticut during the ministry of Chester Colton, Reverend Rockwell's successor. Here you see an artist's impression of the furor caused in Canterbury, Connecticut, when Prudence Crandall opened her boarding school to students of color. Reverend Colton from Lyme preached a sermon on brotherly love that year in the neighboring town of Brooklyn, and he may well have voiced anti-slavery sentiments in Lyme as well, but church records give no hint of that, and his sermons have not survived. In 1839, when captive Africans from the ship Amistad awaited trial in New Haven, and ministers like Leonard Bacon in New Haven championed the cause of the captives, a committee of leading church members in Lyme met to consider what they called difficulties now existing in the ecclesiastical society and how to resolve them. The resolution was to dismiss Reverend Colton, and before a consortium of ministers could meet to confirm that decision, the church committee decided to erase the records of the meeting at which the decision was made. Not only the record, but a copy of the record. Reverend Colton's ministry ended in 1840, and slavery would be ruled illegal in Connecticut in 1848. Moving a bit more quickly now, you can see the result of renovations to the interior of the meeting house in 1850 in this early photograph. The large window behind the pulpit had been removed and the wall plastered over to the concern of some members of the congregation. Here you see William B. Carey, Lyme's post-Civil War minister, in his parsonage study in what had been Samuel Mather's house, with a portrait of Leonard Bacon, the anti-slavery activist, above him. We still have that photograph in the church archives. In 1876, when William Colt sketched the floor plan of the third meeting house, Old Lyme looked like this. Here you see an illustration from an article in Harper's Monthly that celebrated the town's natural setting and its most important residents. The image echoes the earlier drawing by John Warner Barber, placing the meeting house in the center of the landscape and looking west toward the meeting house hills. To the left, you can see that the Baptist church had by then been built on the main street. Today, it's a private home. The fourth meeting house by 1876 had already become widely celebrated for its elegant architecture. This is the engraving included in the Harper's Magazine article to celebrate America's centennial in 1876. When the Sunday school gathered for a formal photograph in about 1900, Reverend Charles Villiers appears on the left. Women of the church and children, dressed in their best clothing for the occasion, pose on the front steps. I've looked carefully, and it's hard to tell if there is a person of color among them. The church became so famous by the end of the 19th century that it appeared on the cover of Ladies' Home Journal magazine in 1906, with an imagined congregation of elegant parishioners leaving after a Sunday service, attired in long dresses and top hats. The interior of the meeting house had been renovated again in 1887 by Henry Rutgers Marshall, Betsy Webster's grandfather, to restore the original architectural details removed in 1850. Not until that later renovation were the gallery pews that had been reserved for people of color removed. Here in this undated photograph, you see the meeting house interior beautifully decorated for the harvest season. The fourth meeting house tragically burned to the ground in an arson fire in the summer of 1907. The whole town mourned, not only residents, but artists like Childe Hassam, who lamented the loss of so much beauty, and many others who had worshiped there over many years. Residents fought through the night with buckets of water, but there was no way the church could be saved. Catherine Luddington, who lived next door, recalled how the old spire with its heavy bell fell with an awful crack. Arson seemed certain, and arrests were made, but guilt could not be proved, and no one could ultimately be held responsible. It took 3 years. It took 3 years to rebuild the church. This is a rare photograph of what one writer described as the fire-swept corner. As construction proceeded, a fierce debate over the style for the fifth meeting house had finally been resolved. Rather than a red brick fireproof structure, the new church would replicate as closely as possible the previous meeting house, but with fireproof materials. I want to close with this clipping from the New Haven Register that heralded the dedication of the fifth meeting house, which we know today, in 1910. When future President Woodrow Wilson, a member of Old Lyme's summer congregation, offered the dedicatory address. The ideal New England church at Old Lyme, the newspaper reported, was dedicated today. Steve, I'll turn it over to you if you have any questions.
Well, Carolyn, thank you so much for that wonderful lecture. I mean, yeah, it was a delight for me to just kind of sit back, and it was as though somebody was telling me a story. So thank you for that. One of the things I want to point out is that I'm sitting right now. Can you go back to that image of William Carey?
Sure. I'm going to have to flip through, though.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oops, sorry. There it is. There it is.
There it is. All right. So I don't know if folks will be able to see, but I'm sitting right here in this room. You see this? So there's that post in the wall, and that's exactly, this right here is exactly where William Carey would have been seated in that.
We can see the same bookcases, Steve.
Yeah. Different books, I'm gonna venture, but the continuity through all of these centuries of history is remarkable. And so to see these images and to hear these stories establishing that continuity, I just think is priceless. So Carolyn, for the work that you've done to draw this out and to assemble all of these materials, I just am so grateful.
I just want to say, Steve, that I know that was a kind of a whirlwind journey through a long period of time. And I was trying to weave together 3 different strands that I found to be important in understanding the history of the meeting house. One was sermons, so we could see what is it that ministers were talking about. I always heard their names, but I had no idea who they were or what they said, and especially no idea what their personal lives were like. And the second was scandals. Some of them were theological, and some of them were personal, and some of them I thought were quite shocking. And the number of cases of fornication to which people confessed during Jonathan Parsons' ministry was really, surprising. Who knew, as they say. So that was another dimension of what was going on inside the meeting house that I certainly, for one, had never understood. And I think it's important in a rounded view to talk about more than just the beauty of the building and to look at the sketches that we have made as best we can of what the earlier meeting houses might have looked like from the outside, and rather to think about what happened inside that structure. What were people talking about? What were they doing? What were they debating? And so on. And also, because now of Black Lives Matter and all the issues of social justice that we all think about and reflect on pretty much constantly. I think it's significant to recognize how widespread enslavement was in the meeting house. I just want to point out that one interesting thing to me is that only a small number, and I haven't counted yet, but I will at some point, only a small number of those enslaved in Lyme by church members were baptized. Only a small number joined the church. Some of them did, but many of them, for example, Judge William Noyes' slaves, he was very prominent in the church. His son was a member of the building committee for the new building and so on. He never baptized his slaves. He recorded their births in the town records, but he never baptized them. And I never really understood why, since he was supposed to be a very devout person, a very devout person of faith himself. But I think it's important to recognize that there was another community here in Lyme from the very beginning, right from the time the town was first founded. And perhaps it's more important to me because I grew up here, as you know. I'm the 11th generation of my family to live in Lyme, in Old Lyme. And I had no idea there were slaves here, growing up here, going through schools here. Everything that I heard from families, from neighbors, from church, from teachers, I had no idea we had slaves right here in Lyme, in our town. So it's important to me that children today, and parents as well, understand that the town did have slavery, and it had it very actively and for quite a long time. As I said, even in 1810, long after the Revolution, the Noyes family still held 6 slaves, the descendants of the first minister. So those are just points. Since I went rather quickly through a lot of information, I just thought I would touch on briefly at the end.
Yeah. No, I think it's so important to have those stories. And I guess I'm curious for you, you grew up with a very particular picture and a particular understanding of what this community was. And so as you're going through these archives and learning these stories about enslavement, about essentially ethnic cleansing of Native peoples, what did that do for you as you were having to grapple with that stuff? I think that's significant. It's powerful.
Well, it's a good question, Steve. It made me decide to devote the last part of my life to exploring it and writing books about it, basically, so that other people would have information that I never had. And I think that's a simple answer. I've done a lot of things professionally in my life, and I decided that I would like to spend the last part of it here, back in Old Lyme, rooted in the archives, and delving into a story that I myself never knew.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want you to know that I think that's I find it so valuable to have those stories available to us. And I find it so valuable that you're doing that labor and opening those stories for all of us. So I want you to know how much I appreciate and admire the work that you're doing to educate us all on on this history that we live with.
Thank you, Steve. And I just want to say as a last note that it's personal for me. One of my Huntley family relatives, that was my father's last name, Huntley, and John Huntley came to Lyme in 1661 and built his homestead on the site of the present library on Main Street. And his grandson or great grandson, I can't remember right now, James Huntley, did own a slave. That's the only Huntley slave I found. That family wasn't as wealthy and certainly wasn't as educated as families of ministers and judges and whatever. So they don't seem to have had very many slaves. But as I say, these are neighborhoods that I grew up in, with families that I grew up with and my parents and grandparents did. So it's fascinating for me to see it all with fresh eyes and look at the story in new ways.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll have a chance, I hope, to talk further about some of the stories you're discovering about enslaved people here in Old Lyme, because I want to explore those stories further with you, and I want other people to be able to hear those stories as well. Um, but maybe I can just end on one of the places that found myself actually very moved, and it was with this minister that we're seeing right now, William Carey. Um, and the description that you gave of his, he came right after the Civil War. So he was the minister that followed, is it Davis Brainerd?
Yes, that's right.
Um, and there's this description that you narrate of his early resistance to Lincoln, and the ways in which he thought Lincoln was not fit for public service, and how he underwent a very powerful conversion, essentially, which led him to join the Civil War, which led him to have personal experiences with Lincoln, and to come back and wind up becoming the minister here in Old Lyme. I thought it was a really powerful conversion narrative that maybe we all uh, can learn from as we're discovering these stories of enslavement, and the ways in which it makes us responsible,
Yeah.
not only to the past, but to the future. It seems that William Carey underwent that process, and it changed him.
And you never know, Steve, what makes people change. People do change, and they change radically, the way William Carey did, from thinking that Abraham Lincoln was absolutely just terrible to really almost idolizing him, seeing his human side and seeing his greatness as a statesman. And it's interesting to think about, what is it that brings about that conversion experience. We can see how it happened for Carey. He went off to be a minister on the frontier in Abilene, Kansas, after he went to Union Theological Seminary, and then ended up in Old Lyme. He didn't stay for too long, but he ended up here where he had remote relatives,
Yeah,
and it is a fascinating story, and one I think we can learn from. People do change.
people do change. That's right. That's right. Can I ask one last question of you?
Of course.
Yeah, was there an episode or a period within the church's history that you were especially attracted to as you wrote this, that kind of made you go, yes, I don't know, I don't know, that somehow you were drawn to, for positive or negative reasons, perhaps. Um,
Well, it's always a mix when you look back and when you look at historical experience. And I think maybe what was perhaps most compelling of all for me, compelling, I won't say, what attracted me. I don't know, that could be negative or positive, as you say, but the period I found most compelling was kind of a period of negative space. That ministry of Chester Colton. I'd never heard of Chester Colton. Most people have never heard of Chester Colton, but he was here for 13 years. He was very much admired. He led the revival movement called the Second Great Awakening. He led Lyme through the temperance movement that has all kinds of implications, which I write about in the book. We could talk about another time. And then this sort of crisis with in the churches in Connecticut's congregational churches, with some of them becoming pro-abolition and some remaining pro-slavery, developed. You can see it very clearly in Guilford and in other churches nearby. And Colton got caught up in that. And it seems likely to me that, since we know from the Congregational General Association records, that was the big organization of the church in the state, we know from those records what Chester Colton preached about in Brooklyn, Connecticut, at the exact same time that all this furor was going on next door in Canterbury. The minister in Canterbury had refused to let the persons of color, the Negro, as they call them then, the Negro girls, attend church in Canterbury, but they were allowed to worship in Brooklyn. So the Congregational Association, I think quite boldly, with Leonard Bacon obviously partly behind it all, met in the town next door, the town that was welcoming those young women of color. And our minister from Lyme preached there the main sermon, the keynote sermon, as it were, on brotherly love. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And I think that's quite powerful. And it seems likely to me that he would have conveyed his sentiments or preached similarly in Lyme, but we can't know. There's not a hint of a reference, and none of his sermons survive. So, what I mean by a sort of negative space is that I found this vacuum around Chester Colton. Nothing was written about him. I had to piece it together, and I had to look at the church treasury because initially they said they didn't have enough money to pay him. So I had to look and see, well, how much money was there in the church treasury, and put it all together and read his letters, which we hold in our church archives. It's amazing how much we have left from 1832, 1838, 1840. That's a long time ago. And I tried to put that ministry together as one chapter in the history of the Meeting House. And to me, that was maybe the most perhaps meaningful piece of the whole jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the work that you did to unearth the connections of Chester Colton's ministry to abolitionism, to the Prudence Crandall episode, and then his eventual dismissal, and perhaps to the Amistad case as well. Yeah, that's a remarkable period and a remarkable tale. That yeah, I read with deep fascination. So yeah, it's worthy of a, I don't know.
But what is my biggest disappointment, Steve, personally? My biggest disappointment is I could find no reference to abolition sentiment in the church or in the church community ever. And I looked so hard for that because I wanted to find it, and I may still find it. I'm still looking. But so far, not a single record, not a single reference in church records could I find actually to abolition sentiment. Reverend Brainerd, who preceded Reverend Carey, as you mentioned, did join the colonization society, the American Colonization Society, which wanted Negroes, I'm going to use the old word, the word they used, which wanted Negroes to be emancipated so that they could be shipped back to Africa. And that was not a sentiment that was widely embraced by the African American formerly enslaved community. So I did find that Reverend Brainerd had those sentiments, but I never found anybody out and out championing abolition in Lyme or Old Lyme.
And it seemed to me, as I was reading your book, it seemed to me that perhaps all through the Civil War, Davis Brainerd actively sought to tamp down whatever controversy or whatever
Yes.
Feelings may have been present one way or the other.
Yes, I think so. I think it was a divided community, and I think he saw his mission as preserving the church and enlarging it because that was a time of out migration. A lot of people were leaving, and the church was dwindling in size, and there was a lot of controversy around between Republicans and Democrats and around, let's say, the Dred Scott decision in 1856 and the tumultuous years that led up to the Civil War. And I think Davis Brainerd, my sense of him is that he was a very good and earnest and a well-meaning person. We have only 3 of his sermons, but if you read his sermons, you can hear his voice. And he seemed to want to keep politics out of the Meeting House.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I confess that as I read it, that was a moment where I wanted politics right up and right up front. But alas, that was Davis Brainerd's decision to make, and not my own.
And he was beloved. People loved him and admired him greatly. And so
Yes.
just in one more instance of how people in the church responded to the events of their times. It's an interesting, I could give a whole different talk or presentation about that using Stephen Johnson and Jonathan Parsons and Davis Brainerd. There's so much that you can learn and that you can, so many dots that you can connect when you start searching through the history of this particular meeting house. It's really a very fruitful and rewarding procedure. Tedious sometimes, I admit to that, but also very rewarding.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think we should probably bring this conversation to a close. I could talk about this stuff for a long time to come, and I hope that we'll have an opportunity in the coming weeks to revisit some of these stories and to explore further some of the stories that you've already begun to share here about enslaved people and about Native peoples. That feels really, really important to get at. And I know that's going to be, that's another book project that you're working on right now.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So I'm
trying to piece it all together.
Yep. well, we eagerly await that next book. And anyway, just know how impressive I think Forgotten Voices is, know how powerful I think this whole project that you're pursuing is, and know how grateful I am and our church community is for the work that you've done to tell these important stories and to get into the archive and to do the work that nobody else has done. It's powerful work, Carolyn, so thank you.
Thank you, Steve. It's actually a privilege, and I'm very happy I'm able to do it. Thank you for today.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, with that, we'll bring it to a close. And I'll just use this as an opportunity to sign off for all of you who were watching. I hope you enjoyed that lecture today, that presentation from Carolyn. And again, I hope you're well. This is me giving you a big hug, virtual hug, a sign of love in this time of Corona. Love you all, and see you soon.